Robert D. Clark Honors College, the Oregon Humanities Center, the UO Libraries, and Undergraduate Studies. Tonight's title is Comprehensive Immigration Reform, and I'd like to point out that we have a bibliography of the things talked about tonight just at the end of the table if you want to grab one of those at the end of the thing. And I'd like to introduce our moderator, Margie Paris, the professor of law and the Philip H. Knight, Dean of the University of Oregon School of Law. All right, there you go.
Super. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to serve as the moderator of this panel. What an interesting and important and timely topic we're going to be discussing today: immigration reform, political, economic, and historical context. Immigration reform has been on the agendas, as you know, of several recent presidents and several Congresses, and soon it's to become front and foremost on the agenda of the Obama administration and on this Congress. But many questions remain. What are the needs of the immigrant community here in the United States and those who desire to immigrate that need to be addressed in order for immigration reform to be comprehensive and successful? How can we tell how large the immigrant community is in the United States, in the state of Oregon, in our counties? What are the lessons of history that will affect the upcoming attempt to reform and modernize United States immigration policy? What are the political pressures that we're going to see being brought to bear? How will the U.S. Economic struggles and the struggles throughout the world of peoples to feed themselves and to have meaningful work, how will those struggles modify what is possible in terms of immigration reform? All these and probably other issues will be addressed by our wonderful panel tonight that comes to you from a range of different perspectives. We have scholars, we have activists, we have advocates, we have planners, and I think you'll find that each of them has important commentary to bring to bear. I'm going to introduce our panelists very, very briefly. They're certainly free to tell you a little bit more about themselves and the work that they do. After I introduce them, I'm going to ask them to give about 10 minutes of commentary to you. I'm going to be keeping time on my trusty iPhone, and if I shout down the line here that you've got a minute left, that's you'll know to time yourself accordingly. And then once we've heard from our panel, we'll have lots of opportunity for questions from you. So, going down the row here on my right, our first panelist is Francisco Lopez, who's the Executive Director of Causa, Oregon, the Immigration Rights Coalition. Next to Mr. Lopez, Guadalupe Quinn, Immigrant Rights Advocacy Program Coordinator at Amigos Multicultural Services here in Eugene. Next to her, Professor Daniel Hosang, who is in the Political Science and Ethnic Studies departments. Next is Nick Fluria, who's the Program Manager of the Sustainable Cities Initiative here at the University of Oregon. And finally, Raquel Hecht, well-known immigration rights attorney here in Eugene, her own law firm by the name of Hecht and Norman. And without further ado, Mr. Lopez.
I have my own timer here, so I will.
All right.
Okay. Well, good evening. I'm Francisco Lopez, and I'm the director of Causa, is the Oregon Immigrant Rights Coalition. And, I want to acknowledge here that she doesn't work just with Amigos, but is a member of our board of directors, Causa, Guadalupe Quinn. And I would talk basically about what is the situation with immigration reform right now, where we're going, how the current climate and the political spectrum in D.C. will impact what we're doing. I think probably I'm one of those that when there is a power crisis that we have in government right now, we have all these crises after the loss of Massachusetts by the Democrats, a very symbolic loss. Many people get into the cynical mood. Actually, I get more hopeful because in the times of worst crisis in power is when you can accomplish big change. But that's just the philosophy, an immigrant from Latin America, that think that's way things work. And I'm originally from El Salvador, a small country in Latin America. I came to the United States in 1985 as a refugee from the war. I got my political asylum in 1986, 87. and I came at the age of 22. I'm a torture survivor. I came to this country with 400. Well, I left my country with $400 in my pocket. In my pocket, and I crossed 3 borders illegally, including the United States and Mexico. So I did cross through Matamoros and Brownsville, Texas. And then I came, and my first job was a beer runner at the Astrodome Stadium in Houston. Used to carry the kegs of beer to the to the concession stand. Um, well, that's how I started. I'm not a social worker by training. I'm an electrical engineer from the University of El Salvador. I have a bachelor's degree in engineering, so that's what I brought in addition to my $400 when I left my country, my degree and my $400. Um, so I don't come from a person that came here with a visa. You know, I was very involved in the revolutionary movement in El Salvador. So that's just to give you a background. And then happened to be that when I came to Texas, I started working on leadership development, organizing, and trying to put an end to the war in El Salvador, in which we did. The war ended in 1991. And through that time, I became a legal resident, then I became U.S. citizen, and probably I have voted more presidential elections than all of you combined here, most of you. And now, but let me talk about immigration reform. Causa, Oregon is part of what we call the National Immigration Reform Campaign, or Reform Immigration for America campaign. We are part of what we call the management team. This management team has been working for the last year and a half in what we call now the Immigration Reform Campaign that wants to make sure that it's a legislation that will legalize 12 million undocumented immigrants here in the United States. We are part of that management team that includes 600 organizations that include faith community, labor, Latino organizations, Asian Americans, African immigrants, so everybody's there at the table. You can imagine managing all the work of 600 organizations is quite difficult, and we were lucky to, out of those 600 organizations, 20 were chosen to run the national campaign. That was one of those was Causa in Oregon. And many reasons is that the Farm Workers Union and Causa have a long tradition of mobilization, organizing, and advocacy, especially in Woodburn and now throughout the state. And how this will, we have a legalization this year, in which case there is a bill in Congress. It's called HR 4321, and you can find a copy of this. This is the first copy that came out on December 15 of last year that had 92 co-sponsors. Now the number is 106. So the numbers have gone up. Was introduced, as some people thought, well, Congressman Luis Gutierrez, the real maverick from Chicago, came and said, you know, I want to introduce a bill. Well, suddenly he came with the bill, and then the senior member of the Hispanic Congressional Caucus, Salomon Ortiz from Texas, decided, you know, I can be the lead co-sponsor. You know, you don't know Salomon Ortiz. He was the co-founder of the Hispanic Congressional Caucus, was one of the few Democrats that when George W. Bush was running for office, decided to endorse George W. Bush the first time around. Second time he didn't do it, but the first time he did it. But then he came to the event where the Hispanic Congressional Caucus, the Asian American Pacific Islander Caucus, the Progressive Caucus, and the African American Caucus came together and said, we want a bill. And here in Oregon, we only have one co-sponsor, Congressman Herb Blumenauer, no surprise. Actually, we were expecting that. We didn't even need to ask him. He said, I will do it because that's my duty. Your own Congressman, Peter DeFazio, here opposes immigration reform. He doesn't want immigration reform. He thinks everybody should be deported back to their country of origin, and we should get rid of CAFTA and NAFTA first. So you have a homework to do here because Peter DeFazio doesn't like this. So, but that's his own, you know, view or troubling view of immigration. So we have a bill, HR 4321. Senate, there is not a bill yet, but there is a draft of a bill that will be introduced by Senator Schumer from New York, and later on will be, I don't know when to answer the phone. Senator Schumer from New York, and we have a co-sponsor now that is working the details, is Senator Lindsey Graham, a Republican from, I think, North Carolina, South Carolina, somewhere there. It's surprising because, you know, that he came rather than McCain. McCain will still be a supporter, but not one of the co-sponsors. We got Senator Lugar, also that is a Republican, that is one of the co-sponsors in the Senate. Probably the version of the Senate will look very different than will look in the House. The House bill is a progressive bill, but in the Senate, probably will be more heavier in enforcement than legalization. But we will see. We are at the early fights on that. It might be a bill at the end of January or early February, so that's what we're hoping. But you know how things are moving in Congress now and at the White House, things can change. Tomorrow we might be on the president's agenda, might not be. We don't know what his State of the Union address will. He will delineate his agenda for the year. But one thing, the other thing is, so I have the three tendencies now in this whole process. The ones that are very optimistic, that we'll see HR 4321, and then the Senate will have a bill with bipartisan support. Make no mistake, immigration reform to happen needs to be a bipartisan bill. If it's not bipartisan, it's not going to happen. So I want to make sure that we understand that. That's the first group. Then the second group are the group that say, well, we might get not the whole package. We might get only the DREAM Act that will legalize children, undocumented immigrant children that want to go to college, but they cannot do it. And the other is the ag jobs, agricultural workers that can get a visa and job permit to work here in this country. And the third tier is the cynical ones, the one that lost the battle on healthcare reform. They feel so cynical that nothing will happen because they lost that one. Well, we had a meeting with them a year and a half ago and said, well, you lost the battle with healthcare reform 50 years ago when healthcare was commercialized. So don't tell me that you wanted to have this ideal bill, because it's not going to happen. So, and this is the way. I know that these economists, Krugman, talk about, you don't get the whole loaf of bread. You just need a piece of the bread. So, and that's the way the politics work. And that's why it needs to be compromised in negotiation. What is going to happen in immigration? Are we going to get everybody legalized 12 million? That's our goal. What might not happen. We might get only 7 million or 6 million. But remember that in 1986, there were only 4 million legalized. And those Latinos were the ones, and their children were the ones that voted in large mass in 2008, 11 million of us. And 9 million of them voted for the current president. So that's one of the fears right now in the Obama administration is that, and we participated with the premise of immigration reform. That was the first premise. Labor benefited from our vote in Nevada, Colorado, other places, and even Massachusetts. But now the community feels, well, if they don't keep their promise, they should not see our votes in November of this year. And that's real, and it's already happening. I was just waiting for the report of the Latino turnout at the Massachusetts election, and I have a suspicion that was very low because the promise hasn't been kept. And that's what we call in Latin America voto de castigo, that little translation, punishment vote, that you punish the party because they didn't bring the change that they promised to us in 2008. Massachusetts was lost because the change didn't happen. It hasn't happened yet. And that's where we need to be pragmatic. That's when we get to that point of being non-partisan and be pragmatic. We want somebody that will deliver the goods. And that's it. And I over 15 seconds.
Perfect.
Wow.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Gracias.
10 minutes.
Quinn.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank everyone for being here, and also thank Ramphis for inviting me to participate on this panel this evening. So I appreciate, hopefully the information you get this evening is helpful for you to understand better what is the situation for immigrants in our country and in our community, and where we stand around immigration reform, which is a struggle that's lasted way too long and that we're ready to be done with. Once again, my name is Guadalupe Quinn, and I live here in Lane County. I've been in Eugene since 1978. I am an immigrant from Mexico, came much, much earlier than Francisco did. My family came from Mexico in 1951. when I was young, and I grew up in California. And as I mentioned, I've been here in Eugene since 1978. For almost 30 years, I've been working here in Lane County as a human rights advocate and activist. So I've been involved in our community for a very, very long time, mostly with the focus in the last 14 years in the work that I've been doing around immigrant rights. I work with an organization here in Lane County named Amigos, Multicultural Services Center. And Amigos is an agency that's small and pretty much volunteer driven, but our focus is in promoting the rights of immigrants, but also promoting human rights and looking at issues in that framework. Amigos has two programs. One of our programs is a youth program called Juventud Faceta. And Juventud Faceta works with young Latino youth between the age of 14 and 24. And the work that they do is mostly to develop leadership within our young people, as well as involving them in what's going on in the community. And also because most of our youth in Juventud Faceta are immigrants, also involving them in the education and outreach around the issue of immigrant rights and the struggle of their own community. And so Juventud Faceta has done a lot of great stuff, and recently put out a video on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is absolutely great, done by these jóvenes in our community that really showcases this international document that unfortunately many countries, including the United States, doesn't seem to be respecting in the way it should. And so we're really proud of our jóvenes who are involved in the community, and we look for many, many opportunities for them to also learn and develop skills, leadership skills, so that they can continue the work that we've been doing in our community and sort of continue the struggle around human rights. The other program that Amigo has is the Immigrant Rights Advocacy Program, which is the program that I coordinate. And most of our work around the Immigrant Rights Program is one of education and outreach, advocacy, and also networking. And most of our networking, one of the things that I believe really strongly in and have always tried to do since I've been working in our community for many, many years, is to really, really have people understand the value and the importance of working cross issues and cross communities. And so one of the things that we do as part of our networking with our work is that we work with a lot of organizations in our area that are dealing with a lot of different issues. And part of that is to create the alliances and the relationships that we need to create in order to support one another's struggles. And so part of doing that is to be involved in organizations and the struggles that they're dealing with, and also to use that as an opportunity to develop alliances and educate people about the struggle of the immigrant community, which is not new, historical in this country, but also to look for folks to support the struggle that we find ourselves at right now. The other piece of our work that I do is around advocacy. In our community here in Lake County, there's an enormous amount of need that we find within the Latino immigrant community, which is the one that I work with the most. And a lot of piece of our work is figuring out, how to support families, how to make sure that they know where the resources are. As advocates, we work with families within the school systems, helping them with agencies, social service agencies, dealing with the police, dealing with the Department of Motor Vehicle, and just sort of, helping families troubleshoot whatever is going on. And so a lot of our work is around advocacy. And our program around advocacy also includes an active Migra response team that we pulled together many years ago that is basically an active group of individuals that would respond if for any reason ICE would come into our area and raid any workplace or whatever. So we have an active response team that would, support those families in case of any kind of a raid, which we've been really fortunate here in Lane County. We have not had a raid that was really awful since in about about almost 11 years. I think the last time there was something really awful that happened when ICE came in and raided several businesses was probably in 97 or 98. So we're set up to make sure that we're here for our community, always making sure that they understand that they're not alone. And so the other part of our work is working at the state level, which is connecting really closely with Causa and other organizations like the Farm Workers Union. And part of that is figuring out how to be allies and supporting what is happening at the state level when all of our representatives are in Salem. Often there's a lot of anti-immigrant, anti-farm worker legislation or proposals that are being talked about. And so our work is to pay attention on how we can support the work that Causa is doing or PECUN is doing and other organizations to make sure that our representatives, hear our voices on the issues that matter to us. And then the other work that we do is at the national level through being part of Causa's board, looking at the issue of comprehensive immigration reform, organizing here locally to lean on our own representatives, organizing here locally to make sure that our community is informed on what's happening with comprehensive immigration reform, what is the talk in Washington, and what are the issues. Here locally, the other area that we work with is I work really closely with Mecha here on campus as well as with students at LCC. And right now here in our community, Mecha has taken the lead around the DREAM Act. And so as a community person with our organization, I'm supporting them in trying to get the city of Eugene to pass a resolution in support of the DREAM Act, which is something that we think is probably really doable. We would rather have a comprehensive immigration reform package, but if we have to look at DREAM Act on its own, that's something that we really want to make sure that we're supporting and are really moving forward with the students who have taken the lead, on this. Yeah, the DREAM Act is federal legislation that's been talked about for many, many years, which would allow students to pay in-state tuition and with the opportunity to later on, with some criteria, be able to adjust their status. This is for undocumented immigrant students to be able to continue their education. And it's not free education, it's allowing those students to have the opportunity to pay in-state tuition in order to later on adjust their status. And we have fought for tuition equity, which is the same thing but at the state level. And unfortunately here in Oregon we haven't been able to accomplish that, but we're going to continue to move forward, support our students, and who knows, maybe we can get the DREAM Act to move forward as we really need it to move forward. So with that, I think I'm just going to stop, and I'm happy to answer any questions later on. I also want to mention that I brought some brochures about our organization that I put on the table there. We have a website. Also, Juventud Faceta has a website if you're interested in looking at the work that's being done locally. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Sure, okay. Hi, good evening, everyone. Thanks again for coming. Thanks, Ranfis, for organizing this. I was asked to talk a little bit more about some of the kind of historical dimensions of this debate, and I just want to mention kind of three quick kind of precedents to keep in mind as this debate might unfold next year, kind of three historical legacies that we might keep in mind as we're watching a debate over comprehensive immigration reform unfold. And I teach and write about racial politics primarily, and was a community organizer for 10 years before I returned to grad school. The first thing to think about, number one, is that for roughly 85 to 90% of our nation's history, our federal immigration and citizenship laws have been explicitly based on theories of white supremacy. So for 85% of our nation's history, immigration and citizenship laws have explicitly been based on theories of white supremacy. We find this in the very first Immigration Act in 1790 passed, that citizenship was limited to free whites. We find it in the crucial Dred Scott case in 1856, where the Supreme Court essentially rules that black people, free or not, have no legal rights, which a white man is bound to respect. And it gives us the first notion of a person who could be legally within the territory, but be a rightless person. It's a notion we're familiar with today. having millions of people legally within the territory, but actually not being rights-bearing citizens. And it starts off in slavery. And in fact, if we would look at Oregon's first deportation case, something we would call a deportation case, it probably happens in the 1840s when Oregon is first a territory. The settlers immediately pass a law banning all black people from the territory. A neighbor says, I have a hunch that the guy living down the street in Salem is a black person, brings suit against the court, and the court actually orders him to leave the territory. And that's arguably our first deportation case. These laws continue with Chinese exclusion in the 19th century, the 1924 Immigration Act, so this is well into the 20th century in the lifetimes of some of our parents or grandparents, is not just based on white supremacy, it's based on Nordic supremacy. That only immigrants from England, Germany, and Ireland are given kind of reasonable allotments of visas, and from every other country in Europe, immigration is essentially shut off, and from Asia, it's banned altogether. Such that in the 1930s, the only two nations that have race at the center of their immigration and citizenship laws are Nazi Germany and the United States. Not even South Africa at this point. And it's not until 1965 that race isn't really an explicit part of the country's immigration and citizenship laws. So it's something to think about, that even when we don't hear race explicitly mentioned, it's absolutely intertwined with our fundamental concepts of nationhood and citizenship. Okay, so that's number one. The second thing is, while debates about immigration and citizenship have always been about race, they've also always been about kind of alleged moral inferiority and superiority, kind of the characteristics, who was fit to be a citizen. So that very first 1790 Act that limits citizenship to free whites also has a clause of good moral character. So there was always an association, not just kind of race as a proxy for who is admissible, but that immigration and citizenship laws are places where we police what constitutes fitness for citizenship, what defines national identity. And you find that absolutely in the Dred Scott decision. It's a long elaboration about fitness for citizenship. In Chinese exclusion acts, in the 1924 immigration debates, long kind of debates about where lawmakers are laying out what qualities and criteria make up citizens. And into the 1950s, you see disabled people or people with disabilities banned from citizenship, not being fit for citizenship, gays and lesbians not being fit for citizenship, people of certain political persuasions not being fit for citizenship. So morality is always at the core there, race and morality, okay? And the third point I want to make is that these connections then between race and fitness for citizenship continue to haunt us today. We can't simply just divorce them. We can't just exercise them in our mind and say race is off the table. Because in the debates that I think you'll hear unfolding, you've certainly heard in the last 10 years, that you're likely to hear in the next couple of years, continue to be about what characteristics allegedly qualify someone or disqualify someone from kind of membership in the national community. So when we hear allegations, they, the moral they, those who are not fit, have babies, they refuse to speak English, they take our tax dollars, they commit crimes, they spread disease, we're constantly smuggling back in both these legacies of morality and fitness for citizenship and the kind of white supremacist basis of our nation. And which is not to say then that race completely exhausts the kinds of analysis we can do about the policy, but it's to say that we abolish it from our analysis really at our demise. In other words, to understand the full import of these debates, we have to think about these legacies. The last thing I want to say is that this connection then between race and morality, not only can you find it, I think, in those that want to restrict immigration, I think you also find it in the dilemma it poses to immigrant rights advocates. Because even though since 1965, race is no longer the formal and legitimate basis on which people can be excluded, and it's turned more to moral characteristics, it means that if you're advocating for immigrant rights, if you're saying we should not restrict, we should expand, you have to make your argument in those moral terms. You have to say, not these folks, not us, we're good, we can contribute. And so you can see it in that the policies that have some traction are for example, undocumented students who are seeking in-state tuition, who can be framed as high-achieving students who only want to give, people in the military, people without criminal records, and you're able to kind of cordon off a portion of people seeking citizenship and say, look, they fit these moral criteria, they should be admitted. The problem, of course, is that leaves then a vast number of people who may not fit this moral bar, so to speak, who are essentially left without rights and without any claim for rights. And I think that's the way in which even the moral, when the kind of moral bars replace race, they can still haunt a notion of a just citizenship policy. All right? So those are the three things that I'd suggest we might keep in mind. The white supremacist basis of national citizenship and immigration policy, the way that morality and fitness for citizenship has always been at the core of these debates, and how the connection between the two is often quite fraught and always present.
That was fast. Let's see if we have luck with this to see if technology's on my side today. My name is Nick Fluria. I was actually a student last year in planning, public policy, and management, and this is actually part of my thesis work. I currently work for the University of Oregon at what's called the Sustainable Cities Initiative, which if you're in architecture and allied arts, you may have heard of it, and I also work in the study abroad office. So if you're interested in going to other countries, I assist with that too. But this was part of my thesis work, but I want to focus more on the Oregon context. Take it from the steps that Daniel Hosang's been talking more about from the historical context, and bring it to what's happening now in the state of Oregon, particularly on an economic level, and also in terms of how the population and demographics are changing in Oregon. One thing that's to note is, as we kind of look forward into specific populations, I am focusing on the Hispanic population. And that's not to say that the undocumented population is strictly Hispanic. It's just that they're a large subset of the entire population. But one of the things that they've noticed, especially in Boardman, which is over 50% Hispanic, is that there are refugees that are coming from countries like Burundi and Bhutan who are now working in the farm worker positions that Latinos had in the past. It's been kind of a shift as they're looking for particular types of labor to fill in these positions that they're unable to find. As people get more education, as they develop social capital within their community, as they find different ways of really coping with the mechanisms that are in place in Oregon as well as nationwide, they're looking to different people to really fill in those positions for a necessary, what they consider to be necessary employment to make these industries succeed at a national as well as international level. And this is what's happening in 3 Mile Canyon Farms in Boardman, which is, you can see in Eastern Oregon. It's the largest, actually, cow factory in the, in the Western United States. It has well over, I think it's several 100,000 cows that basically produce. But half of Tillamook's cheese comes from that dairy. Kind of to give you more of a context from the federal level and then move down to Oregon's level, the Real ID Act was passed in 2005, which is a requirement on specific types of documentation in order to receive driver's licenses as well as to receive some types of employment. As they looked at this document, they were trying to find different ways in which the states could enact it, but they gave them a little clause that if they're unable to enact it in certain ways, they didn't have to, or they could make a clause to allow undocumented populations to still receive some sorts of legal documentation in some way. You can see Washington, Idaho, both have a mechanism in place so that there's ways of getting driver's licenses. But in 2008, Oregon passed Senate Bill 1080 and the executive order, which completely nullified that. So driver's licenses have changed significantly in Oregon, and there's much steeper requirements and stricter requirements on people if they want to receive a driver's license or a state-issued ID. No-match immigration rules was something of contention that came out a few years ago, and that was specifically looking in terms of employment. If you had just one document off, they would search you and you would have to find something in particular to make sure that you could legally work. It was going to affect not just documented people, but also undocumented people. So they both had that problem as they were looking forward into seeing what was going to happen with their actual work positions. If you couldn't locate your social security card, it doesn't matter if you were legal or not, could cause a problem for you in the future. And then I already mentioned Senate Bill 1080. That was something in Oregon specifically, but it puts Oregon at a different position than it does its neighboring states, where there is a possibility for undocumented workers and their families to seek other forms of employment, and also where you have more rights as actually being in this country. Kind of looking at context since 1990, Oregon has seen a population explosion, particularly in the Hispanic population, from 112,000 in Oregon in 1990 to 396,000 in 2007. And this population is increasing 17,000 a year. You can see in terms of percentages, in terms of population increases, it's largely centered in the Willamette Valley as well as in Bend, which is no surprise since the population is largely increasing in Bend. But you can see it's not just a specific phenomenon in certain rural areas, as the case may be. In fact, urban areas are seeing the largest influx. Looking in terms of the percentage of Hispanics in Oregon, it's gone from 4% up to 11%, by far the largest minority in the state. Concentration in terms of Hispanic are certainly limited to specific counties in Oregon. You can see Marion County, that's where Causa is based, in Salem and Woodburn, Jefferson County, Hood River, Morrow, Umatilla, as well as Malheur counties in eastern Oregon. Those are particular areas that have a large focus on agriculture, and you see there's a lot of agriculture, manufacturing, construction, and accommodation and food services, the four main industries that you find undocumented workers in, that are certainly at a heightened group population in those areas. In terms of the undocumented population in the U.S., 80 to 85% of it is Hispanic. It's largely Mexican. As you look at Oregon, it's between 73% and 92%. So it's definitely, when you look at in terms of the undocumented population, it's largely Mexican. It's not to say it's exclusively Mexican, but that's a way in which I could actually do my study and find out at the county level what might be the undocumented population across it. Many of them are no longer temporary. There was a policy in the past, Bracero program in the 50s, where you could come over as a farm worker and then you had to go back in most cases. Comprehensive Immigration Reform in 1986 sort of changed that in a lot of ways, in that a lot of people didn't have that opportunity to go back. In fact, a lot of it was moving back and forth, but 80% was temporary back in the 1970s, and now, in fact, it's more like 25 to 30% is temporary at this point. Many people are staying, raising families here, really becoming part of the social network as well as part of the community. At this point, only 7% actually return every year to Mexico if they're migrant farm workers from Mexico. So it's significantly reduced. A lot of them are making their living here, and it's become increasingly difficult to cross the border. They're not facing just in terms of legal repercussions, but some of the ways they have to cross are becoming much more difficult and much more deadly. As I already mentioned, they're concentrated in specific industry sectors, again, looking at manufacturing, construction, agriculture, and accommodation and food service. William Jagger is a professor at Oregon State University. He did a study to find out, in the event where the entire undocumented population was forced to leave the state, as well as their families, what would happen in terms of employment as well as industrial output in the state. The short-term effect is between 6 to 8% in terms of employment as well as industrial output losses. In the long term, just because some industries may be able to adjust, it still doesn't get back to what you were before that point. You'd still see about a 5% decrease in terms of employment as well as in terms of industrial output. It's a large portion of the population when you look at the fact that it's 4.1% of the state's population is undocumented. So there are induced as well as indirect effects as you look between industries, and then since the industries have to adjust their prices, people can't afford as much goods, less people are employed to sell those goods. So there's a lot of different effects. It's not just affecting undocumented populations. It's affecting their families, 73% of their children who are U.S. citizens, as well as other populations who are undocumented. In terms of the undocumented population by county, see, I tried to figure it out in terms of gross numbers, but there's an estimate of about 150,000 undocumented people in the state. And if you break that out, you can see it's definitely concentrated in the urban areas, looking at Marion, as well as Washington and Multnomah counties. Larger population, certainly not the highest percentage in terms of undocumented population. But you can see there's several counties on the eastern side of the state that do come up blue, and they don't have very large populations. So as you can imagine, there's a much higher concentration of undocumented workers in those 6 counties I mentioned before. Marion County on the west side of the Cascades, and then Jefferson, Hood River, Morrow, Umatilla, and Malheur counties in eastern Oregon. All those counties have more than 8% of their population is undocumented. And this is in the case where a lot of these counties have 20% or 30%, upwards of 30% of their population is Hispanic. So it's not just that the entire population is Hispanic and undocumented. Many of the Hispanics are documented. There's just a segment of the population that's undocumented. If you look in actually breaking that down to see what types of industries they face in, if you look in terms of farming, you can see it's overwhelmingly an undocumented workforce. 61% of Marion's County, based on my estimates, is actually undocumented. If you were to lose that crucial segment of the farm population in Marion County, it'd be very difficult for the industries to adjust to that loss in order to be competitive against other states as well as other nations in terms of looking at their goods. A large portion of Oregon's output goes to Japan as well as into China and some of the food goods that are produced, finished goods. And Oregon would really have a difficult time trying to keep up with that. In terms of construction, you can see Hood River and Marion and Morrow counties certainly fit the bill as the highest. Between 35 and 45% of the workforce is undocumented. Manufacturing is slightly less, but you can see in accommodation and food service, it's still around 1/3. For comparison, look at Oregon at the bottom, and you can see those counties have a significantly higher concentration of undocumented workers. In terms of looking at payroll and what would be the total loss, not just for undocumented workers, but as well for undocumented workers, payroll in terms of the entire county and what becomes tax revenue, as we're looking at measures 66 and 67 in about 15 minutes closing. You can see it's certainly a large loss in these areas, 20% up to 32% in Morrow County of their total payroll being lost. That changes their property taxes, that changes their local, changes their local tax base. It changes the income tax. It changes what the schools receive. It changes what healthcare receives. It completely revolutionizes what they will have to do in that county if they expect to keep their populations. Boardman School District just built a new elementary school, and they had to increase another school in another city instead of consolidating. That wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for the influx of population there. A large population percentage of it is Hispanic, but that's a population that has been there in a lot of cases for over 25 to 30 years. Definitely an established population that's part of the county's population as well as a local community, and they work in those industries, and they attract specific industries that can work there. I'll even get into that a little bit, as Morrow County has seen 2 different industries want to locate last year in the state. Long-term effects in terms of employment, you can see very similar numbers. Since undocumented workers typically earn less than documented workers, you'll see there's a larger increase in terms of employment losses. In terms of what I see as implications for this, I've sort of mentioned a little bit in terms of the industries. Family does in fact matter. If you look at these populations, more than half the families have at least, if there's a Hispanic family, at least one of them has one undocumented member. You lose one undocumented member of the family who's working, that's lost income to your family. That makes the family structure with poverty, increases risks of actual trauma, affects on the children in terms of their education, it affects the family structure. The family depends on that extra income in order to survive. They already earn a lower wage to begin with, and it makes it difficult for the family to even survive if they lose one particular member of the family due to, for example, an ICE raid. If you look at, in terms of taking a number, that's in reference to the DMV, since you do have to take a number. That's, I guess, sort of one benefit for DMV is reduced lines, but they have seen a decrease in 1,900 driver's license issued per month. That's lost revenue to the DMV, and that's less ability for them to issue driver's license as well as identity cards in the state. So the less that they can issue, the less money that DMV receives, and they're not certainly getting it from the state at this point. For every reaction, there is obviously a reaction. In terms of what's happened, Washington and Idaho, certainly their licenses, families are going to be able to possibly move to those sections and look for different terms of employment, diversifying the employment base as well as the actual manufacturing base in those states so that they can remain competitive, where Oregon, how is it going to adjust itself enough in order to keep those industries intact and to be competitive on a national as well as an international market? Profiling has also become a problem. We've already talked about racism before, but racial profiling. But 10% of undocumented as well as documented Hispanics are being stopped and asked for their identification to see if they're documented or not undocumented. They're US citizens in this country, and they're still being stopped to find out what their documentation is to see if they're legal. It's not for any other reason. They're being stopped solely just because it's racial profiling. In addition, I talked about a little bit about the economy of Morrow County. Morrow County used to have the highest unemployment rate in the state in the late 1980s. With an influx of populations and industries that have moved in the area, it had the 5th lowest unemployment rate just last year out of 36 counties in Oregon. They've been able to attract a couple of industries. One of them was Amazon.com. They want to build a $1 billion facility in the county because there is a stable employment base, a population that they can easily rely on to work in that industry and to make sure that it's successful. Part of it is being located next to the Columbia River, but a lot of it has to do with the employment base, since there is an easy way of receiving employment that is in some way skilled and can make sure that that manufacturing base continues. The limits of my study certainly depend on variability. I'm looking at estimates of an undocumented population and then estimating to the county level. So estimates of estimates, there's certainly variability in it. Additionally, you're looking at the dependent that I do have on William Jager's study, as well as Pew Hispanic Center studies in terms of figuring out those numbers. Even that said, this is just giving you a picture that it's really not the same if you look at Lane County or Clatsop County, or if you take a look at Morrow County. Lane County will not be affected in the same way as Morrow County will be in terms of its employment base, in terms of its community and what's possible in those places. Certainly it's possibility to adjust when you have a low percentage of your population undocumented, but when you're looking at 36% employment and payroll losses in Morrow County, how is it going to adjust when half the cheese in the state is made there? When the majority of its milk comes from that one county? When the second largest port in the state in terms of tonnage is in that county and just has 12,000 people? To say, when you look at the largest port in the state, Portland has well over magnitudes of what Morrow County can produce, but it's still a very important part of Oregon's economy. Things can change. We've already mentioned sort of the DREAM Act. There was a House bill last year called 2939 that didn't really make it off the floor. It's not going to make it off for this February special session either, so we guess we can hope for 2011. Adjustments that can be made in terms of how undocumented will affect wages. There's almost sometimes two different economies, it's argued, that are at work, where the undocumented population occupies certain jobs and doesn't compete with other populations that are looking for other terms of employment. There's been mixed numbers across in terms of how they affect wages for other populations. Normally, the only effect is really towards high school graduates. It doesn't affect, it seems, college graduates as much. In fact, it has a positive effect towards wages because there are more skilled jobs available once there's a segment of the population working in those unskilled positions. And it doesn't seem that the border impacts that they're having really are affecting wages. A lot of it has to do with the economy. There hasn't been much of a change in terms of the documented population in the country for the past couple of years, and a lot of that has to do with the economy, not in terms of what the border restrictions are. If you do look at the undocumented worker market, you can see that it occupies a different segment of the population. They're working in different jobs than most of the population are working in, and if you took all those jobs away from that population, the legal population can only occupy 5% of their jobs in lowest sector, leaving 95% of the jobs that need to be filled in Oregon unfulfilled, with those industries having to adjust and make that change in terms of the undocumented population being gone from the state. It's not that I'm saying that the entire undocumented population is leaving the state, but every little policy that is affecting the population of undocumented is not just affecting that population, it's affecting documented members of their family, as well as people who are considered to be U.S. citizens in other races as well, or that could become from the some race that are already in this country. Mexico is already the largest contributor of documented population in this country. It also happens to be the largest of undocumented, but that's something that should also be considered. It's not just affecting one group, it's affecting the entire state, as well as its ability to compete against other states, as well as compete at the international level. We'll save questions till the end.
All right. Well, since I'm the only lawyer here, I guess this falls to me to bring it out a little differently here. Which is, let's look at some of these issues here in terms of, this is a talk actually this is part of a talk that I gave at Rotary, so it's not geared to the liberal crew necessarily, and I think that's good. I think we need to look at what the issues are and not just why we're all in favor of immigration. So this is a talk entitled "Should they stay or should they go?" And this is my favorite way of wording it, and the way I always like to look at things, which is this how I want to spend my taxpayer money, especially when we're talking about border security. But in any event, what am I doing here, Ramphis? This one here? Ah, the one on the right here. What do I do with the one on the right here?
Just slide it down.
Slide it down. Really? Oh, go. Should I do? Yeah, thanks. And so just slide this down? Oh, whoops. All right. So this is a little cartoon I have. It says, this should keep them out, ain't that right, Miguel? And they're building the wall of China. And so, I like this cartoon because it really shows that what we're talking about is workers. And I do think that the issue is, one, how much does the wall cost to build, to keep people out? That's part of it. But the issue the overlying issue in immigration is, what do we need people here as workers? And I think it's a fair assessment to say most Americans, maybe not me, maybe my view is that we should just open up the borders completely, but that wouldn't be the majority view. The majority view is that we should have controls on who should get to stay and who shouldn't. And so one has to look at, what is the positive contribution, which I think you've looked at to some extent. But it's not 100% clear because depending on which survey you look at, you're going to get a different answer. Here is the influx of immigrants to the United States. Gives you some idea of the levels that we're at this point. And it opens up the question of what level do we want to be at. The peak there in 1990 was the Agricultural Workers Program amnesty, and an amnesty for people who had been here since before January 1, 1982. If they had been here illegally, in illegal status, in undocumented status before that date, they could apply for a general amnesty to reside here within a certain amount of time. So that's what you're looking at there. And the people after that are basically, a lot of them are family members, and a lot of them are not, poor Mexican workers. And I think when we're looking at immigration, we're not just looking at a bunch of poor people, and not all Mexicans are poor people. And so I think that needs to be kept in mind too. A large number of our immigrants are people who graduate from the University of Oregon and go out into the community and get jobs in high-level areas, and people who my husband, who's a professor at the University of Oregon, who's from Norway, for example. There's not just all poor people coming to this country, but in any event, we could focus on that. So who are these people? One, long-term visa overstays, people who get visas to come here to visit, they like it here, they stay. And there are some estimates of 4 to 6 million people who are living in this country who came here legally, probably middle class to upper middle class people if they were able to get visas, and they stayed here. People who entered the country illegally, and those are generally the people that we're looking at from Latin America, because Canadians cannot enter illegally. They basically they don't need a visa, so they just can come here. But the second biggest group of people that we deal with in our office are Canadians. So they could come from the borders and all of Central America as well, that they come in through the borders. People married to U.S. citizens. There are a large number of people here who are married to U.S. citizens. This is a little-known fact, apparently, and that is who are not eligible to immigrate to this country. And that is because they had, for example, their mother got sick. They went down to Mexico to visit their mother. They came back again. They are no longer eligible because of anti-terrorism laws. Somehow that's related to terrorism. I've never been able to figure out exactly why or how that's related to terrorism, but apparently it is. And because of those laws, even if they're married to U.S. citizens, they've lived here for 20 years, all their kids are here, whatever it is, they're not eligible to immigrate. They'd have to leave, go to Mexico, stay there for 10 years, and they would, at that point, could apply to return. There are people married to legal permanent resident. LPR stands for legal permanent resident. Those people are put on waiting lists, and they may or may not be eligible to immigrate. If they made an illegal entry into the country at this point in time, they're not eligible to immigrate to this country unless they leave the country and apply from abroad, at which time, if they've been here unlawfully, they need to apply for a waiver. They need to show extreme hardship to that U.S. citizen spouse. It's a very difficult thing to do. It's actually what I recently spend most of my time doing right now because it's so complicated. Adult and minor children of legal permanent residents. So if you're a child, you turn 21, even if you've lived here for 10, 15, 20 years, you might be sitting around still waiting for your card, for your number to come up in order to immigrate to this country. So there are a lot of people here who I think probably a lot of people would agree have sort of paid their dues, their whole family's here, and they're still sitting around waiting to immigrate. And all those people have to be looked at separately in terms of determining who is it that we want to stay and who is it that we're going to say, no, we're closing the border down if that's what we're going to say. Ooh, what do I got going here? Ooh. Oh, I like this picture because, I like these guys. They let me take their picture, clients of mine, because I can't tell which one's the immigrant. And if you talk to them, you really can't tell. They both have been here since they were 8 years old. one legally and one not legally. The one who is not in legal status was orphaned and brought here by his aunt. Oh, I gave it away. Brought here by his aunt. And, has lived here his whole life, went to school. He was a very bright kid, is a perfect candidate for the DREAM Act because he would love to go to college, has real dreams and real industrious. But unfortunately, because the aunt, who is a U.S. citizen, never adopted him, he now is married to a U.S. citizen. But as I said, you've been here illegally. You can't get your papers inside the country. You need to leave. You need to show extreme hardship. And she looks like a healthy, young, healthy girl. So I don't know how we're going to show extreme hardship, but story to be continued, hopefully in a good way. I put this in on criminals here. I think, this is a good question, and it's always on people's mind. Well, what about all these people committing crimes? I don't have the statistics on here, but the number of immigrants who commit crimes is actually proportionally much lower. But that's just an aside, because I still think that people have this question. And so let's look at a criminal here. Let me skip this because I don't have a lot of time. Now here's my favorite criminal of the day. This man, Marco Alvarado, in this article here, is really a nice guy. But unfortunately, Marco was found in 1991 after he got his green card in 1990. He's been here since 1970, so he's lived most of his life in this country, coming across the border with a very large packet of heroin underneath his car, which unfortunately for Marco, he doesn't admit it was his. Because if he had admitted it was his, and he had admitted that he had committed this crime, he could have pled guilty to the delivery offense in 1991, could have served his time, and he would have been eligible at that time to apply for a waiver. But that's sort of a complicated issue, and I have this case in federal court, and because of that complicated legal issue. But Marco never admitted that he knew about it. It's a long story, and I actually believe him, but you never know. So, but the jury did not believe him, and he was found guilty of transporting drugs. It's a old conviction. After he served his 2 years, he became a very religious, born-again Christian. He opened a Christian bookshop in Salem. He sells Christian literature. He's a very active member in the community. Really a good guy. I mean, clearly reformed. I don't think there's anybody who would agree that he's not completely reformed from this incident that happened, 17, 18 years ago. However, the laws currently say that unless you pled guilty, so because he was found guilty and didn't plead guilty, he doesn't get to stay. And it's an automatic deportation. So that's before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals right now. It looks like we're going to lose. It looks like somebody else already lost on that issue, and we're next up. But he's standing there. But so that's that's the question. Here's what our laws look like right now. Commit a crime, doesn't matter when, anytime, automatic deportation. So the question that I like to raise here is what kind of discretion should there be in the laws? I mean, should we forgive Marco? Or should we say, look, you did it. You weren't a citizen. You should have known you weren't a citizen. You're out of here. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. I'm not going to go into Tapio. This is a federal court decision that I had that had to do with a guy who came in and out illegally, and we actually won that case. He's now a U.S. citizen. Here's Nate and Sarah. These guys were in the paper recently. You might have seen them. I actually changed the heading on this one. It says Mother Teresa or Evil Monster. And Sarah here is a Canadian citizen who evilly married Nate in Canada. And she did, I have to say, probably was pretty bad advice. When she came to the border, she didn't say she was married. Because of that horrendous evil act, she was expeditiously removed back to Canada and separated from her husband for 2 years They almost didn't make it. The entire community of Eugene is such a great community. I mean, we're really lucky we live here. The entire community of Eugene wrote letters saying, this is outrageous, but not just that, talking about the extreme hardship to poor Nate here if he doesn't get his wife back. And finally did grant her a waiver showing the extreme hardship we had to show to get her back in. But so here's what the law looks like. You show up at the border and they don't like your answer, you know, I mean, okay, side one is you lied. You didn't say you were married. You said, you know, she had a student visa. You weren't really just coming back to be a student. We are now going to punish you, and, you know, we've got to uphold our laws. That's the way it should go, okay? Side one. Side two, you know, slap, slap, Sarah, that was stupid. You know, go back, get your visa the way you should, and then come back in 6 months the way, you know, it would make sense. And so, but after 9/11, this is what we're getting. So maybe that's okay. Maybe you say, yes, Sarah shouldn't lie, and we got to take a hard line on it. Or maybe you should say, which is what I would say, man, you know, chill out, Border Patrol. It's not that big a deal. And, you know, why are we treating people this way? Because it's not just Sarah, who, by the way, has her master's in theology and spends all her time in Los Angeles working with poor people. I mean, this is the person we've just spent 2 years and all kinds of money keeping out of our country. So, okay, just to end here, to cut short, okay, here's my bias. What would a good immigration reform look like? I'd just like to make a little comment on some of the things that were said here, and that is the pundits in Washington believe, and they could be wrong, that there's no such thing as piecemeal immigration reform. It's going to be all, I mean, you can't, and this is why there was some criticism of Ron Wyden and, you know, the other guy who got in the other day, Jeff Merkley, it's going to say Smith, but it was actually Merkley, for not voting on E-Verify, which has to do with, you know, you get a check to see whether they have good documents or not. And, you know, how could they not vote on this? Well, for very good reason, you don't vote on one thing or another at this point. And that is, you're giving up the horse. You're giving up, well, I can't think, it's too late at night for my expressions here, but you're giving it all up if you vote on the E-Verify, because that's an exchange for everything else that you want, right? It's like, you're going to, if I'm in Congress, I'm going to say, yeah, I'll vote for your E-Verify system so there'll be no undocumented workers, but in exchange, I want the DREAM Act, and I want, you know, legalization of this many people or whatever else. And then they'll say, okay, well, I want border security. And so there's got to be this give and take. That's the way it works. And so it's all got to be together. There's no piecemeal, just the DREAM Act. And I sincerely doubt that that's going to happen, I'm sorry to say. But that is what they are all saying. And so let me just make a couple of other points. Here you do get to see what Raquel Hecht thinks about immigration reform. And that is, I do think it's a big problem that families are not united at the current time. There's these long waiting lists. For example, if you are the son of a Mexican person and you turn 21, right now your petition had to be filed before 1992 in order for you to currently immigrate. So that's like, what, almost a 20-year wait. I would also like to make a little comment about the race issue, which I think was very interesting. But I don't think that it's a fair assessment to say that our immigration laws are currently race-based, except on this one issue, and that is on the waiting lists. Because as it turns out, there are quotas. So when they went from being racist to being a quota system, I think they really, you know, and that issue of good moral character, I mean, I think that's fair enough, right? I mean, you gotta have, you know, I mean, most people don't want people immigrating here who have criminal records. And right now, the issue, what good moral character means in immigration law means not a criminal record. That's what that means. You know, when I go into court, that's what I'm talking about when we're talking about good moral character, at least from my perspective. But in any event, There is one way in which I do think that race is an issue, and that is when they issued the quota system, they have numbers of people from each country who can come in. But in the first preference category, if I'm a US citizen and you're a US citizen, but my child is from Mexico and your child is from Holland, your child is going to immigrate like 5 to 10 years faster than my child. And we are both US citizens. So really you're saying something against a US citizen, which really isn't very fair. Someday that's going to be a federal court case that you're going to see my name on because I'm going to bring that up. And I don't think the Supreme Court is going to find it amusing, actually, so it's not going to be right now. Allow employers to show they're unable to find US workers for the job. As it is right now, there are all these employers who walk into my office and every day and they say, geez, if you get rid of my Mexican workers, we're going out of business. So what are you going to do about it? And I'm going to say, call your senator, because it really sucks for you. And that's the end of the story, because there's nothing you can do right now to show that you can't find US workers for the job. And that is the issue. That's the question. So, you know, you should be able to show that. And you should also have laws that show that if you can find US workers, well, that's who you're going to hire, because there's an issue there too. I mean, there are two sides to that issue. It's not just, you know, nobody's going to fill any jobs ever. So, all right, and then make it more difficult to employ undocumented workers. As I said, I think that is an issue that we have to do if we are serious about immigration reform. If we're serious about legalizing people, legalizing those who are here, who we've invested in, who we've spent money on, who we have sent to schools, who have bought houses here, whose children were born here. If we're serious about that, we need to also be serious about not saying, hey, come on down, you know? Come to our country, come get a job, come live here, and then say, hey, wait a minute, guys, you're here illegally. Go home, there's a recession going on. You know, it's not fair. It's not, you're playing with people. It is not a fair way to do it. And so in my opinion, number one priority, make it so you can't work here. If you're serious and you don't want people here, and you're not gonna legalize them, and you're not gonna treat them like second-class citizens where they can't travel, they can't visit their families, you know, they're afraid every day that they're gonna be picked up, then you gotta make it so they really can't be here. And that's the way you're gonna make it. Otherwise, they are gonna be here. You need to acknowledge long-term residents, and you need to allow discretion back in the laws. Like I said, you know, you got to look at the facts of the situation. Okay, and here's another one. I like this one. You fellas need a job. And then if we do have time, maybe in questions, I wouldn't mind making a note on the Canadian system so you can see a little comparison. You know, what we have done, what the Canadians have done. I'm not saying one's better than the other. It's different, though. It's a point-based system. It's a different system. And it's something to sort of ponder as we go through this debate as to what are the issues that are important, how should we be looking at our immigrants, and who do we want as our immigrants. And that's it. Oh, thank you.
Panelists, I appreciate all of your wisdom. We're going to take questions, and I think what I'm going to do is kind of get up and wander around with the microphone so that we can hear your questions. So, what do you wonder about? Over here. Whoop.
Hi, I have a question for Raquel on the element that you mentioned right now on reform, that you would ask for them to make it more difficult to employ workers who are undocumented. And I'm wondering if that would follow legalizing workers who are already here, or you're assuming, would it be the second step to that process?
It has to be all in one.
Okay.
You can't give that up, which has been what the you know, conservative anti-immigrants have done. They keep saying, well, sign my bill that you know, provides for verification of employment before there's a discussion about what we're going to do with all these people who are already here. And that's ridiculous, because you're just giving it away, and then there's no give and take. But yeah, no, I do think that has to happen. And I think that everybody agrees on that. I think everybody in Washington agrees at this point that we have to agree with the E-Verify system, and that it will be a beneficial system, for everybody.
And then I have another question about, other than that, you would have visas for workers to come in and work after that, I assume. But then you mentioned language and education as things Canada had done.
Yeah,
I'm not sure if
Canada has a point system where they look at, do you speak the language? How high is your education level? What ties do you have to Canada? They allocate points to you for each thing that you have. Are you in a job classification that we need? They allocate points based on that, and then if you, reach their point level, they give you a visa. They give you a
So
green card or whatever.
how would
Landed
we
immigrant.
handle people who aren't coming here necessarily to do farm labor that we would hand out those labor visas for, but also aren't coming here as highly educated, already English familiar semi-citizens almost? How do
Well-
we handle just like the average person who wants to come here to pursue something different that isn't necessarily going to be a part of the typical labor force that they're filling a need for, but isn't the higher educated force?
Well,
either?
the first question there is, that's the debate that has to happen in Congress, which is, who do we want to be our immigrants? Do we want just anybody who doesn't fall in this category or that category? It's like, okay, I just want to come to the United States. I doubt that's where that's going to go. The debate has to be there, here's how many farm workers we calculate, what kind of visas are we going to give these people? Here's how many other people, what kind of ties do they have? Right now we have the most ridiculous system that has to do with the lottery. I don't know who came up with this one, but we every year we give out 50,000 visas to people as long as they have a high school education who fill out a form and say they want to come live here. They have no ties to this country. They have no reason to believe that they'll be good immigrants to us. We don't have any reason to believe that they're contributing to a part of the economy where we need them. It's just this random, and the whole point to it, there's a race issue there too. The whole point to it is to give out other races so that we have diversity, so that not everybody looks Mexican or whatever the main, Filipino, Mexican, Chinese. It's totally absurd. Why should we give 50,000 of those people when we have at least 50,000 people in our own community sitting right here who have proved themselves to be good citizens of this country?
Okay, so you're saying that future citizens would also have to make that proof in order to come here, in addition to people who are already here and are going to be legalized?
I'm just throwing out here, how are we going to look at what our immigration reform should look like? What are the issues here? What have we done, and how, what should we do?
Great. Who else has a question? Sir.
Yeah, I was just curious. I wanted to learn a little bit more about the DREAM Act, just how far, if it's looking more like possible legislation, like it could actually happen, and in what phases, and also that film Papeles that they showed around here, if that has had any sort of national attention around it, and if that's helped.
Oh yeah,
at all.
definitely. It was profiled on CNN. The papers documentary have been shown in a lot of places all over the country. The DREAM Act is has bipartisan support in the Senate and in the House as well. Has a strong chances this year, but I will say that let me tell you, it's we want an ideal immigration reform system, but if we don't have the whole comprehensive immigration package, what will happen is we'll get some candy, and the candy will be DREAM Act and the Ag Jobs, because there are so many things at stake here. For see, the thing is that the only way that we'll have legislation, immigration reform, would not be because of humanitarian reasons. Let's take that out of our minds. That's not going to happen. Suddenly, Congress became a humanitarian body. Probably you're in another country, perhaps in Canada. But no, you're not in Canada. You're in the United States, where the whole parliamentary system is totally different. And the party representation is different. There is special interest. Immigration reform will pass only if there is because of economic reasons. It will not pass for humanitarian reasons. So we are certain of that. We have been told that by Democrats, the president, and we have told that by the Republicans. Number one. Number two, the Dream Act, they look as I heard, you heard, they see it more as an economic opportunity. And the same with ag jobs. Oregon especially will benefit from ag jobs. There are a lot of farm workers, etc. Uh, so I think that's the way we see the Dream Act as a possibility. But our advocacy efforts is for the whole package, and that's what we're fighting for. 12 million undocumented immigrants. We went and we accept from the concept of so-called amnesty to what the bill called earned legalization. Not everybody automatically will become a legal resident. They will have a job permit that will be in 6 years, and then eventually they will be eligible for U.S. citizenship in 10 years. So it will not be automatic. They will have to pay a fine, learn the language, etc. Now, among Latino organizations, a large majority, we're willing to take that risk. Because either we take that or we don't get anything. The border security, that's a battle that we already lost. Even the people on the border would tell you, we just need to learn how to live with that. Real ID, we already lost that one. It's not just impacting immigrants, impacting everybody in this room. So we already lost that. So we are not going to get ourselves embarking in something that we already know that is the reality, is the law now, basically. So, but then we need to see what is possible. So we deal with this big tension as organizers at the national, the world as it is, the world as should be, and we deal with that tension. Because we don't believe that the tooth fairy will leave us $1 under the pillow and we'll be all happy. It's not going to happen that way. But the Dream Act will help 65,000 undocumented students that graduate every year from high school and cannot go to college because they don't have their papers. And it's a whole process, but there are some details in the HR 4321 that is included there. Any more questions?
I think that Guadalupe had something to say in the Dream
Yeah,
Act as well.
well, and I think one of the things that's important to think about is, comprehensive immigration reform will happen because of economics. And the reason we find ourselves where we're at around immigration is because of economics. Historically in this country, it has been a pattern, and if you look at the history of immigration in the United States, you're going to see a pattern of importation, exploitation, and deportation. And the reason we find ourselves, I think, where we're at right now is because we have not been looking at immigration from where we're supposed to be looking at immigration from, and that is looking at who is here, what are the laws, what are future flows. What we've looked at immigration at historically has been one of ensuring this country cheap labor. And in many ways, we still look at it that way. So to me, it's like we find ourselves where we're at because of economics, because this country has always wanted cheap labor, and the only way we're going to get comprehensive immigration reform is because of economics, because the only thing that folks understand is money here. And we have to be willing. I mean, what we see as advocates in immigrant rights and human rights advocates is, we have to do something to address the 12 million people that are already here. And then we have to be really serious about looking at future flows and looking at comprehensive immigration reform and immigration laws in a real way, and not just keep thinking about setting it up in a way that only benefits this country of cheap labor. Or we'll find ourselves back where we started, and that's why, to me, the issue of the Dream Act, no, we don't want just the Dream Act. We want a package. We want comprehensive immigration reform that addresses all the stuff that we care about and that addresses some of the issues that Raquel has mentioned. But we also want to have something. We're not going to throw it all out. If all we can get is the Dream Act, then we'll take it. Because for some of us, the struggle for immigrant rights, the struggle for comprehensive immigration reform is something that we've been looking at most of our lives. This isn't something that showed up yesterday. I've been in this country since 1951, and there's moments here in the state of Oregon that I'm appalled at the way that immigrants are treated, which is worse than I've ever seen in all my life in this country. And the anti-immigrant sentiment, to me, is something we should all be really concerned about. The amount of hate and the amount of scapegoating that's thrown at the immigrant community in this country is really, really scary, including here in Oregon. And so we have to look at it from human rights. We have to look at it from what's impacting our families every day in this community and the kind of stuff they have to deal with, including the issue of racism and racial profiling and the issue of economic justice and all the stuff that we talk about.
I think I saw a question over here a minute ago.
Just curious what you think about the amnesty that went through in '86 under President Reagan. Do you see that as really, are we going through that again, or any of those arguments going to be viable today, or are we in a totally different
We'll be totally different.
situation?
Well, just the numbers. In 1986, were only 3 million, between 3 and 4 million undocumented immigrants that got their amnesty. I think the process right now will take longer than took the amnesty program for people to finally get their green card. They are not calling amnesty, they're calling earned legalization. So you have to learn English, pay a fine, pay back taxes, learn about civics, and go through a whole process that will be more demanding than the amnesty of 1986. Now, one thing that happened in 1986, some of you that are young to remember, and were kids probably then, in 1986 was also an election year. In 1986, there was a crisis of power here in this country. Remember the Iran-Contra affair? Which many of you probably don't remember. The Iran-Contra affair, Ronald Reagan was giving, there was a crisis on power. We were embarking in a horrible mess in Central America. Where hearings every day, people were, it was a mess. Iran, so you name it. So that happened in '86. And then we were coming out of the recession of the early '80s, too. So the climate now, for us, is not new, but the numbers are huge. Now, I just want to add to the economics of immigration, Professor Raul Hinojosa Ojeda from UCLA, on January 7, released a report, a study about the economic impact. He's in the study that he did with the Cato Institute and several others. He said that if there is a legalization of 12 million undocumented immigrants, the gross domestic product will grow $1.5 trillion in a period of 10 years. So the economy will grow tremendously. Now, how much money will cost us to deport 12 million undocumented immigrants? Will cost us $2.6 trillion. So if you're ready to spend $2.6 trillion, well, and that's what the president has been talking about lately. We're not going to spend that money. So that going back, if it's done, it will be done for the economic reasons. That's why the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is behind comprehensive immigration reform. The Oregon Nursery Association here, they joined us in a rally last year. Never seen anything like that. We all been on opposite sides of the table, killing each other. But now they were at the table. The Oregon Restaurant Association. Oh, yeah, we want immigration reform. Actually, I would tell you, we are sitting in the same management team with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Farm Bureau and all these guys. What are you doing here at the table? That's why I'm not that cynical, even though that people, we tend to be cynical, but sometimes who cannot be with this government that we have. But at the same time, I think there are some indicators that things might happen, but will not happen to the extent that probably we want it. But it will happen something. And that's what we are negotiating now.
If I could just, I actually think that it would be very similar to the two reforms. There were two reforms in '86, and those were people who were undocumented, and that was one class of people, and those were other class, or who had come here illegally and overstayed a student visa for many, many years. And also the other group were people who had worked for at least 90 days in an agricultural job. So it's true that it's a smaller number of people. I think that what we're talking about when we're talking about immigration reform is absolutely very similar. The other one also was at least a 2-year wait to get your green card. There was a temporary status, and then it turned into a permanent status. Similar ideas. The difference, I think, is that at this point, the American people are very set, and especially after the 9/11 and the fear on terrorism and fear in general, is that it will become there were not enough protections against the future immigration, and that's what we have now. And so the IRCA, which is that reform in 1986, had a law that said yeah, you need to show a social security card and a green card in order to get a job. So that was actually a change in the laws but from before. But they didn't say, we're going to check to make sure that's a good social security card. We're going to make sure you didn't buy that green card off the street. We're going to strengthen our borders so that it's really not that easy to get in. We're going to be checking these things. We have a system now that's just recently put in place where anybody's arrested, basically any place in the United States, and immigration is automatically notified of the arrest and the quality of the arrest, so they can come and come get you right now. That's the first time we've seen that ever. So there's going to be a lot of changes in terms of enforcement, and I think it's pretty darn clear that there's not going to be any immigration reform unless all of those enforcement provisions are also accepted. So it's going to be a big change.
No, and that definitely, and I agree with that. Yeah. We had a meeting with the Homeland Security about how the implementation would be. Causa is part of that team that met with Homeland Security about talking how they will, looking at the details. They told us the first 2 years, don't expect that you will be submitting applications. There will be a registry, a national registry that will take place, that will be computerized, etc. But don't expect that you will do what they did in 1986. Will take a long time. So after 6 years, people will be available, different than was the amnesty in 1986. Will take a little bit longer. Will be messy, but I think we're willing to take that risk. For the reason is that we are against the wall in terms of people that have lost their license, people that are losing their livelihood because they cannot, work. Because now they are not doing your traditional rates now like they used to. They are doing what we call desktop rates. They just go and tell the military farms and independents, they came and say, you have 350 workers here, in 30 days you have to prove that they are all legally here working, or you will get a $10,000 fine for each of them.
We just have a few minutes left. I just
Okay,
want to.
so I just want to
give Daniel a chance to close because I see that you've had a comment you
Well,
wanted.
I think 86 is entirely instructive because I think there is this fantasy going on that there is actually a way to criminalize certain kinds of migration to stop it. And history has shown in 1965, if you allocate national quotas, there we can criminalize it and stop it. In 1986, we can, in raids, we can build walls. And I would firmly say if we look at the historical record, criminalizing those kinds of flows doesn't work. And what it does is it creates a criminalized workforce and a decriminalized workforce. And we can see how it's worked with drugs and other things there. So, I think 86 then is quite instructive about this notion that right now we're going to draw the line, and everyone after that is really going to get the message. It's like a really interesting fantasy to watch people get it. And were we to actually apply it even-handedly and watch all of you whose social security numbers are a little off just be kicked off your jobs, whether you're an attorney, people would be absolutely furious. So either you have to implement the law on a discriminatory basis or subject all of ourselves to a kind of national no-fly list type thing. And I don't think that happens. So, I think this is why we need some of these things in the past to remind us.
I think on that end, I think we actually have to stop because our time for the tape is up. Please, let's thank our panelists. Now, I know that you can actually stay after and ask the panelists any questions you want to. This ends the formal program, but